His name was a prayer and a curse, breathed into the space between their lips. Leo, please, we can't. The words were a ghost of a protest, lost in the heavy air of his downtown art studio. The scent of oil paint and turpentine mingled with the salt and heat of their skin, an intoxicating perfume of the forbidden. His hand moved from the small of her back, fingers tracing the delicate curve of her spine, and every ounce of her resistance dissolved into a soft, shuddering sigh. This is madness, she thought, even as her body arched toward his, craving the very thing her mind screamed was a betrayal. He silenced her thoughts with a kiss, deep and consuming, a kiss that tasted of wine and desperation. Shh, just for a moment, let me feel you. His voice was a low murmur against her ear, a vibration that seemed to reach into the loneliest corners of her soul. Just this once. But they both knew it was a lie. It was never just once. This heat, this all-consuming fire, was the only warmth Alara Blackwood had known in 6 months. 6 months since she had traded her name, her future, and her freedom to become the wife of Damian Blackwood. Her home was a sterile, sprawling penthouse overlooking Central Park, a palace of glass and steel where silence was the loudest sound. It was less a home and more a museum of a life she was supposed to want, filled with art. Damian's curators had chosen an furniture that was beautiful to look at but cold to the touch. He had saved her father's company from utter ruin, buying it, and her along with it, in a single, merciless transaction. He was her husband, a man whose power was a shadow that fell over the entire city, a man who owned her in every way that mattered, yet had never once looked at her with anything resembling desire. To Damian, she was his most beautiful acquisition, a symbol of his victory, meant to be admired but never touched. Her life was a gilded cage, and until Leo, she hadn't realized she was slowly suffocating. But here, in the beautiful, creative chaos of his brother's studio, surrounded by canvases that held more life than her entire marriage, she could finally breathe, even if each breath was laced with the poison of guilt. The memory always returned to her in the quiet moments after she left Leo, a chilling counterpoint to the warmth that still lingered on her skin. It would rise like a specter, smelling of expensive leather and quiet desperation, taking her back to a day that felt like a lifetime ago, a day when the world had been bleached of all color, leaving only the stark black and white of a deal she could not refuse. It had been raining that Tuesday, a relentless, miserable downpour that seemed to wash all the hope from the city streets. Her father, Richard Vance, a man who had once commanded boardrooms with an easy, booming confidence, sat beside her in the back of the car, looking small and defeated, his reflection in the rain-streaked window, a portrait of a king who had lost his kingdom. Vance Innovative, the tech company he had built from the ground up, the legacy he had intended to leave her, was bleeding out, hemorrhaging money so fast that bankruptcy was no longer a threat, but a certainty measured in days. Every bank had turned them down, every investor had pulled away, leaving only one final terrible option, a meeting with Damian Blackwood. Blackwood Tower was a shard of obsidian piercing the gray sky, a monument to the kind of ruthless power that had crushed men like her father. The elevator ascended in unnerving silence, a smooth, swift climb that felt more like a descent into the underworld. Damian's office was on the top floor, a vast expanse of minimalist design with a floor-to-ceiling window that offered a god's-eye view of New York. The city spread out below them, a sprawling, intricate toy set, and for the first time, Alara understood that from this height, Damian didn't just live in the city, he possessed it. He didn't rise to greet them. He remained seated behind a desk of polished mahogany, so large it felt like a barrier between worlds, his hands steepled before him. He was even more imposing in person than in the countless articles written about him. Dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his dark hair impeccably styled, he was a study in controlled, predatory grace. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of slate, cold and devoid of any discernible emotion, yet they missed nothing. They swept over her father with a flicker of something like contempt, then settled on her, a long, calculating gaze that made her feel appraised, measured, and priced. He let the silence stretch, a tactic designed to amplify their desperation. Her father finally broke it, his voice raspy as he began to lay out their situation, a painful, humiliating confession of failure. Damien listened without interruption, his expression unchanging. He was a statue carved from ambition. When her father finished, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Damien finally spoke. His voice was not loud, but it filled the cavernous room, each word precise and weighted. "Your company is worthless, Richard," he stated, not as an insult, but as an undeniable fact. "Your technology is outdated. Your debt is catastrophic. I would be a fool to acquire it." Hope, a fragile, foolish thing, died in Alara's chest. She felt her father flinch beside her. But Damien hadn't finished. He leaned forward slightly, the first hint of movement, and his cold eyes found Alara's again. "However," he continued, the word hanging in the air, "I am in the market for a different kind of merger, one that is less about assets and more about aesthetics, legacy." He laid it out with the dispassionate clarity of a surgeon discussing an operation. He would absorb Vance Innovative and all its debts. He would give her father a comfortable face-saving position on a subsidiary board and a generous pension. He would ensure the Vance name was not dragged through the mud of public bankruptcy. In return, he wanted Alara. He wanted her as his wife. He spoke of her beauty, her education, her family name, as if they were items on a balance sheet. He needed a wife to solidify his public image, a beautiful, poised partner to host his events and complete the picture of his success. He was offering to buy her father's legacy, and she was the price. Alara felt the blood drain from her face. It was a proposition so archaic, so futile, it felt unreal. She looked at her father, expecting him to roar, to protest, to defend her honor. Instead, she saw the profound, gut-wrenching shame of a man who knew he had no other choice. He couldn't even meet her gaze. In that moment, she saw the truth. This wasn't just business for Damien. This was the final move in a long game of revenge, the ultimate humiliation for the man who had once been his rival. He wasn't just taking Richard Vance's company, he was taking his daughter. "I'll give you a moment to discuss it," Damien said, rising smoothly and walking to the window, turning his back to them in a gesture of absolute confidence. He already knew the answer. Alara felt a wave of nausea. She was a thing, a commodity, a beautiful, breathing, closing condition for a hostile takeover. Her father finally looked at her, his eyes filled with tears. "Alara, I can't ask you to do this," he whispered, his voice breaking, but they both knew he was. His entire life's work, the jobs of hundreds of employees, his pride, it all rested on her answer. She thought of her dreams, of finishing her master's in art history, of a life filled with love and warmth, and saw them all turning to ash. Then she looked at the broken man beside her, the father who had given her everything, and she felt a sense of grim, heartbreaking duty settle over her. She stood up, her movements stiff. Damien turned from the window, his expression unreadable. "Well?" Her own voice sounded foreign, a hollow echo in the silent room. "I accept your terms." A flicker of something, a cold, dark glint of triumph, appeared in Damien's eyes for a fraction of a second before vanishing. "Excellent," he said, as if they had just agreed on the price of a stock. "My legal team will be in touch to finalize the details of the prenuptial agreement." The wedding, 2 months later, was the social event of the season. It was a masterpiece of public relations, a stunning spectacle of wealth and power. Alara moved through it like a ghost in a couture gown that cost more than a car. She smiled for the cameras, her face an elegant frozen mask. She felt the press of hundreds of eyes on her, none of them seeing the terror behind her carefully applied makeup. Standing at the altar, Damien's hand holding hers was cool and firm, the grip of an owner, not a lover. His vows were delivered with flawless precision, words of love and honor that were utterly devoid of feeling. When he kissed her, it was brief, chaste, and cold, a seal on a contract for all the world to see. Later that night, as they entered the silent, cavernous penthouse that was to be her new home, he finally dropped the pretense. He turned to her as the door closed, his eyes sweeping over her in her magnificent wedding dress, not with admiration, but with a chilling sense of finality. He unfastened a diamond necklace from her throat, his fingers brushing her skin with an unnerving lack of warmth. "Welcome to your cage, Mrs. Blackwood," he whispered, his voice a silken threat. And as he walked away toward his own separate wing of the apartment, leaving her alone in the marble entryway, she knew her sentence had just begun. The first few months of her marriage were not a period of adjustment, but a slow, creeping process of erasure. Life in the Blackwood penthouse was governed by a silent, unwritten timetable, a rhythm of luxurious emptiness that repeated with soul-crushing precision. Alara learned that silence had a texture, a weight. It was in the heavy, conditioned air that hummed through the vents, in the thick pile of the dove-gray carpets that swallowed the sound of her own footsteps, and in the vast, empty spaces between the designer furniture. She would wake each morning to the pale light of dawn filtering through windows that were as wide as cinema screens, revealing a panoramic view of Central Park waking up. From 50 stories high, the joggers were tiny, determined specks, the city a vibrant living organism that she could see and hear but never touch. Her breakfast would be waiting for her on a small table in her private sitting room, laid out with surgical precision by a housekeeper who moved with the quiet efficiency of a ghost. Sometimes, beside the porcelain plate of fruit and artisanal toast, there would be a small, embossed card. "You have a fitting at Dior at noon." Or, "Mrs. Astor expects you for the charity committee lunch at 1. There was never a request, only a statement of fact. Her days were scheduled by an unseen hand, her time no longer her own. Her husband was a phantom in their shared home. Damien would leave before she was awake, a ghost of his expensive cologne, the only evidence he had been there at all. He returned late, long after the city lights had ignited the sky. Their only guaranteed time together was dinner, an ordeal she came to dread with a visceral, stomach-tightening anxiety. They would sit at opposite ends of a long, polished mahogany table, separated by a distance that felt both physical and metaphysical. The table was always exquisitely set with sterling silver and crystal that gleamed under the soft glow of a modern chandelier, but the space between them was a cold, dead expanse. A silent, white-gloved staff would serve course after course of magnificent food she barely tasted. The clink of a fork against a plate was a thunderclap in the oppressive quiet. Damien would often eat while scrolling through financial reports on a tablet propped up beside his plate, his attention entirely consumed. He was not ignoring her. To ignore someone, you must first acknowledge their presence. For Damien, she simply did not exist in those moments. She was a part of the penthouse's beautiful, static decor. On the rare occasions he did speak, his words were brief, functional. "The Hamiltons will be joining us for the opera on Saturday. Where are the emeralds?" He would say it without looking up, his tone the same one he might use to instruct his driver. She learned to reply with a simple, quiet, "Of course," because anything else was pointless. Her identity was being systematically dismantled and replaced. One afternoon, she returned to her suite to find her closet, once filled with the clothes she had chosen and loved. Bohemian dresses, soft sweaters, worn-in jeans had been completely emptied. In their place hung a new wardrobe, a curated collection from the world's most exclusive designers. The clothes were breathtakingly beautiful, impeccably crafted in a palette of elegant neutrals, deep jewel tones, and stark blacks and whites. But they were not her. They were a costume for the role of Mrs. Blackwood, the elegant, untouchable wife of a billionaire. The fabrics were silks, cashmeres, and organzas that felt foreign against her skin. Everything was tailored to fit her body perfectly, yet she felt like a stranger in every single piece. She was being dressed up, a doll for Damien to display. The separate bedrooms were perhaps the most honest part of their arrangement. Her suite was a sanctuary and a prison, a vast space decorated in muted tones of cream and silver. It was a beautiful, lonely island. A long, silent hallway separated her wing from his, a physical manifestation of the chasm between them. Some nights, she would lie awake in her enormous bed, wrapped in silk sheets that felt cold against her skin, and listen. She would strain to hear a footstep, a cough, any sign of the man she was married to, but there was only the relentless, humming silence of the building. The marriage was not just loveless, it was lifeless, a vacuum devoid of passion, anger, or any human emotion at all. It was a transaction, and the terms were being met. To fight against the encroaching emptiness, Alara tried to create small pockets of her old life. She would spend hours in the penthouse's library, a magnificent two-story room with soaring shelves. But the books, like everything else, felt like his. They were leather-bound classics and first editions, collected for their value, not their content. She would run her fingers over the spines, searching for a title that felt like a friend, but found only a curated display of intellectual wealth. She tried to draw, bringing out an old sketchbook and charcoal pencils. She sat by the window, intending to capture the dynamic lines of the cityscape, but her hands felt clumsy, her inspiration smothered by the sterile perfection of her surroundings. It was impossible to create anything real in a place that felt so fundamentally false. She felt watched, even when she was alone. The staff were discreet to the point of invisibility, yet she was always aware of their peripheral presence. She knew her movements were noted, her choices reported. If she skipped one of the luncheons Damien had arranged, he would know. There were no overt threats, no raised voices, but the control was absolute, woven into the very fabric of her existence. She was an object, and objects do not have desires or plans of their own. They are placed, polished, and admired. They do not live. And in the crushing, opulent silence of the penthouse, Alara Vance was beginning to forget how. The Blackwood Family Foundation's annual charity gala was the glittering apex of the New York social calendar, a night where immense fortunes were pledged and powerful alliances were forged over champagne and canapes. For Alara, it was simply a larger, more crowded version of her own cage. She stood beside Damien near the grand entrance of the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Great Hall, a silent, smiling accessory to his power. She was wearing a gown of sapphire blue silk, a creation from Damien's approved list of couturiers, which clung to her body like a second skin. Diamonds, cold and heavy, glittered at her throat, and ears the Blackwood diamonds, a part of the family vault she was now permitted to wear. She played her part to perfection, her smile poised, her posture flawless. Damien's hand rested on the small of her back, a proprietary gesture that felt less like an embrace and more like a brand. He navigated the sea of influential guests with the effortless command of an admiral, introducing her with the same 3 words, over and over. My wife, Alara. The words were a title, a statement of ownership. No one asked about her studies, her thoughts, her dreams. They saw the dress, the diamonds, and the man she belonged to, and that was all they needed to know. After nearly 2 hours of this suffocating performance, a desperate need for air, for a single moment of anonymity, overwhelmed her. During a brief lapse in the flow of approaching guests, while Damien was deep in conversation with a senator, she murmured a quiet excuse and slipped away. She drifted through the throngs of people, feeling like a phantom, and found her way into a quieter, less crowded gallery dedicated to Dutch masters. The shift in atmosphere was immediate. The loud hum of conversation faded, replaced by a reverent hush. Here, the light was softer, more forgiving, and the air smelled of old canvas and history instead of 1,000 competing perfumes. She stopped in front of a Rembrandt, a portrait of an old woman, her face a magnificent web of wrinkles and wisdom, her eyes holding a universe of untold stories. Alara felt a pang of something she hadn't felt in months, a genuine, unforced emotional response. She felt a kinship with the woman in the painting, a longing for a life that was etched with experience, not just coated in a veneer of perfection. She looks like she kept secrets, doesn't she? A voice said, low and warm beside her. Alara started, pulled from her reverie. She turned to see a man she didn't recognize, standing a respectful distance away, his gaze on the painting, not on her. He wasn't like the other men in the Great Hall, the ones whose ambition was a palpable aura. He wore a tuxedo, but it seemed to sit on his frame with a casual ease, his bow tied just a fraction askew. His hair was a little longer than was fashionable in their circle, and his eyes, when they finally turned to meet hers, were not the cold, appraising eyes of a financier, but something else entirely. They were a deep, thoughtful brown, and they held a genuine warmth that was so unexpected it was almost jarring. I think, Alara found herself saying, her voice a little soft from disuse, that she looks like she truly lived. He smiled, a real smile that transformed his entire face, making it instantly kind. That's a much better way of putting it. Leo Sterling. He offered a hand, and his grip was firm and warm, his palm slightly calloused, the hand of someone who worked with them, who created things. Alara Blackwood, she replied, the name still feeling foreign on her tongue. Blackwood, he repeated, his smile not faltering, though a new understanding dawned in his eyes. Then I suppose I should be calling you sister-in-law. Damien is my half-brother. The information settled in her, surprising and yet somehow making sense of his presence here, away from the main hub of power. He didn't seem like a Blackwood. There was no chill in his presence, no hint of the predatory stillness she associated with her husband. He never mentioned, she started, but let the sentence trail off. Of course, Damien had never mentioned him. We move in different orbits, Leo offered, a simple explanation that seemed to contain a novel's worth of family history. He gestured back toward the main hall. That's his world. This is more mine. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and his next question was not about the gala, or the foundation, or her husband. So, Alara Blackwood, what do you really think of all this? It was a simple, direct question, but it felt revolutionary. No one had asked for her real opinion on anything in months. She hesitated for a second, the habit of caution deeply ingrained, but something in his open, non-judgmental expression made her feel safe. Honestly, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, it's beautiful and terribly lonely. Leo nodded slowly, his gaze full of an empathy that felt like a balm on a raw wound. The most beautiful places often are, and just like that, a connection was forged. They started to talk, their conversation flowing with an ease that felt miraculous. He asked her about the Rembrandt, and when she began to speak about the use of chiaroscuro, about the artist's ability to capture the soul in a single brushstroke, he listened. He truly listened, asking intelligent questions, his interest lighting a spark in her that she thought had long been extinguished. She talked about her abandoned studies in art history, a subject she hadn't discussed with anyone since before her marriage, and felt pieces of her old self stirring, waking from a long slumber. In return, he told her he was a painter, that his studio was his sanctuary from the world of his brother. He spoke of the frustration and the joy of creation, of trying to capture a feeling with color and light. For the first time since she had walked into that museum, Alara forgot she was on display. She forgot about the diamonds and the dress and the role she was supposed to be playing. She was just a woman talking to a man about art, about life, about things that mattered. She laughed, a genuine, unpracticed laugh, at a witty observation he made about one of the guests. The sound felt alien and wonderful in her own ears. It was in that moment, as she was smiling, that the warmth between them was shattered by a familiar, cold presence. There you are. Damien's voice cut through the air, sharp and cool. He had appeared beside them as silently as a shadow. The easy warmth in Leo's posture tightened almost imperceptibly. I see you've met my brother, Damien said, his eyes flicking from Alara to Leo, a subtle, unreadable expression on his face. He placed his hand on her back again, the gesture feeling heavier, more possessive than before. Leo, he acknowledged with a curt nod. Damien, Leo replied, his own voice now carrying a new, more formal note. The easy connection was gone, replaced by a sudden, thick tension. The governor is here. He's asking for you, Damien said to Alara, his words a command. As he guided her away, back toward the noise and the bright lights, Alara risked a glance back over her shoulder. Leo was still standing there, watching her. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement of the moment they had shared. It was a fleeting connection, a brief glimpse of a different world, but as she was swallowed back into the gilded cage of her life, it felt like a lifeline. For the first time, a light had broken through the suffocating silence, and it gave her the most dangerous thing of all, a glimmer of hope. The glimmer of hope that Leo's presence had ignited at the gala did not fade. Instead, it took root in the barren soil of Alara's life, a tiny, fragile seed of rebellion. She told herself it was nothing, a fleeting moment of human connection that meant little in the grand, cold scope of her reality. But a week later, on a quiet Wednesday afternoon, the housekeeper informed her that Mr. Sterling was in the grand salon, waiting to see if his brother was available. Her heart gave a sudden, sharp leap that was both thrilling and terrifying. She took a moment before the mirror, smoothing down the simple gray cashmere dress she was wearing, a dress she had chosen for its comfort, not its style. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, her hands trembling slightly. It was foolish, this flutter of anticipation. Utterly foolish, yet she could not suppress it. He was standing by the vast windows, looking out at the city, his back to her. He turned as she entered, and that same warm, genuine smile spread across his face, instantly dispelling the cavernous chill of the room. "Alara," he said, his voice holding a note of undisguised pleasure. "I was in the neighborhood. I hoped I might catch Damien." It was a plausible, perfectly reasonable excuse, but they both knew it was a pretense. The air between them was already charged with the memory of their conversation at the museum. The housekeeper offered to bring them tea, and for the next hour, the silence of the penthouse was filled with the sound of their voices. They spoke of everything and nothing. He told her about the challenges of his latest painting, a sprawling abstract piece meant to capture the sound of a city storm. She, in turn, spoke of a book she was reading, and was astonished when he revealed he had not only read it, but loved it, quoting a line from it that had also moved her. It was a small thing, a shared love for a forgotten novel, but it felt like a miracle, a secret language only they understood. In that hour, Alara felt more herself than she had in the entire 6 months of her marriage. When he finally left, feigning disappointment at having missed Damien, the silence he left behind was heavier, deeper, and more unbearable than ever before. His visits became a quiet, unspoken ritual. Once, sometimes twice a week, he would appear under the same guise. He never stayed for more than an hour or two, always careful, always respectful of the invisible lines that surrounded her. But in those stolen hours, Alara's world expanded. She began to see the penthouse not as a prison, but as a secret garden where this fragile, forbidden friendship could bloom. The conversations deepened, moving from the safe territory of art and literature into the more treacherous landscape of their own lives. He spoke of his childhood, of growing up in the long shadow of his brilliant, ruthless older brother. He described a lonely boy who preferred charcoal pencils to stock portfolios, whose quiet nature was seen as a weakness in the cutthroat world of the Blackwoods. Alara, in turn, found herself opening up to him in ways she never thought possible. She told him about her own dreams, of wanting to work in a small, quiet museum in Italy, a life a million miles away from this one. She spoke of her love for her father, the love that had led her to this gilded cage, and Leo listened with an empathy that never once tipped into pity. He didn't try to fix her problems. He simply witnessed her pain, and in doing so, made it feel real, and therefore, bearable. The seed of betrayal was not planted in a single moment of weakness, but cultivated slowly, with every shared smile, every knowing glance, every secret conversation. It was a betrayal of the cold, loveless contract she had with Damien, a violation not of her body, but of her soul, which felt infinitely more profound. She began to anticipate his visits with an addict's craving. The sound of the elevator arriving on their floor would send a jolt through her. She started to pay attention to her appearance again, not for Damien or the judging eyes of New York society, but for him. She would stand in her vast, impersonal closet, her eyes skipping over the severe, powerful silhouettes Damien preferred. Instead, she found herself reaching for the things that felt more like her. A silk blouse the color of a summer sky, because he had once mentioned he loved the paintings of Turner. A soft forest green sweater that brought out the color in her eyes, because she had noticed his gaze sometimes lingered there. She would wear her hair down, letting it fall softly over her shoulders, rather than the severe, elegant chignons her husband's world demanded. These were small, secret acts of defiance, a way of signaling to him, and to herself, that the woman he had met at the museum was still in there, buried but not yet dead. She became a student of his gaze. She learned to read the subtle language in his eyes. When she wore the blue blouse, she saw the flicker of appreciation in them, a quiet warmth that was more validating than any spoken compliment. She noticed the way he would watch her hands as she poured their tea, or the way his eyes would soften when she smiled a genuine, unguarded smile. He wasn't looking at Mrs. Blackwood, the beautiful, expensive object. He was looking at Alara. He was studying the light and shadows of her, the melancholy that clung to her like a fine mist, the flashes of the vibrant, passionate woman she used to be. The desire that grew between them was a quiet, powerful undercurrent in all their interactions. It was in the way they were careful not to let their hands brush when he passed her a cup. It was in the silences that fell between them, silences that were no longer empty, but filled with everything they couldn't say. She started to feel a hunger that had nothing to do with food, a deep, aching thirst for something more than just his conversation. She wanted to know what his artist's hands would feel like on her skin, what his warm, kind mouth would taste like. The thought was a transgression so profound it made her feel dizzy, yet it refused to be banished. This was the true nature of her betrayal. It wasn't just that she was finding solace in the company of another man. It was that she was beginning to want him, with a desperation that was starting to eclipse her fear. The storm broke on a Thursday night, the kind of violent, elemental fury that felt personal. Rain lashed against the panoramic windows of the penthouse, and distant thunder rumbled, shaking the very foundations of the glass tower. Damien was in Shanghai for the rest of the week, a fact that should have brought Alara a sense of peace, of temporary freedom. Instead, his absence only amplified the oppressive emptiness of the apartment, making her feel like the last inhabitant of a deserted planet. She was curled on a sofa, a book lying unread in her lap, watching the lightning tear jagged, silver scars across the bruised purple sky. She was so lost in the tempest outside that she didn't hear the soft chime of the private elevator until the housekeeper, Mrs. Dunn, appeared at the doorway to the salon. "Ma'am," she said, her voice as neutral as ever, "Mr. Sterling is here to see you." Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. His visits had always been confined to the safe, bright hours of the afternoon. This was different. This was the night. He stepped into the room, his hair damp from the rain, his cheeks flushed with the cold. He had shed his jacket and was in a simple dark sweater that made him look younger, softer, more approachable than ever. In one hand, he held a bottle of red wine. "I know it's late," he said, his voice a low, comforting sound against the roar of the storm. "But I saw the lights on. I thought you might appreciate some company on a night like this." He was lying, she knew. He had come because he knew Damien was away. He had come for her. The thought sent a terrifying, exhilarating shiver down her spine. She should have sent him away. She should have clung to the tattered remnants of her duty, her honor. Instead, she heard herself say, "I'd like that very much." They sat, not on opposite sides of the room as they usually did, but on adjacent sofas, the wine bottle and 2 glasses on the low table between them like a silent treaty. The wine was rich and dark, and it warmed her from the inside out, loosening the tight knot of anxiety in her chest. The conversation that night was different, stripped of the usual pretenses. The storm outside seemed to demand a similar honesty from them. He didn't ask about art or books. He looked at her, his expression serious, his warm eyes searching her face in the dim light. "Are you happy here, Alara?" he asked. The question so direct, so simple, it disarmed her completely. The truth rose up in her, a bitter, unstoppable tide. Her eyes filled with tears she had refused to shed for months. "No," she whispered, the single word a confession that felt like it had been torn from the depths of her soul. She saw a muscle tighten in his jaw, a flash of something that looked like anger, or maybe pain in his eyes. He didn't say, "I'm sorry." He didn't offer empty platitudes. He simply said, "I know." And in those 2 words, she felt a universe of understanding. He reached across the table, not to touch her, but just resting his hand there, an offering. Without thinking, she laid her own hand on the cool marble, inches from his, a gesture of silent communion. "He doesn't see you," Leo said, his voice barely audible above the rain. "He looks at you, and he sees a beautiful painting he's acquired for his collection. He doesn't see the woman who gets a little crease between her brows when she's concentrating on a book, or the way her eyes light up when she talks about something she loves. I see it. I see you, Alara." His words were a key, unlocking a door inside her she thought had been sealed forever. A sob escaped her lips, and this time, he did move. He was in front of her, kneeling on the rug, his hands gently taking hers. He lifted one of her hands to his lips and pressed a soft, warm kiss into her palm. The touch was electric, a jolt of pure sensation in a life that had become numb. He looked up at her, his eyes dark with an emotion so intense it stole her breath, and then he leaned in and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a deluge, a storm of its own, mirroring the one outside. It was all the unspoken words, all the stolen glances, all the desperate, silent longing of the past weeks unleashed in a single, ravenous moment. Her mind screamed a chorus of protests. This is wrong, he is his brother, this is a betrayal. But her body, starved for touch, for warmth, for any semblance of genuine passion, had a will of its own. She kissed him back with a ferocity that stunned them both, her fingers tangling in his damp hair, pulling him closer. His name was a broken whisper against his mouth. Leo, no, we shouldn't. But her denial was drowned out by a low moan as his kiss deepened, his tongue exploring her mouth with a confidence that made her weak. His hands moved from her face, down her neck to her shoulders. He pulled back for a fraction of a second, his breath ragged, his eyes searching hers for a final sign of resistance. He found none. There was only a raw, terrifying need. With a slow, deliberate movement, he reached behind her, his fingers finding the delicate zipper at the back of her dress. The sound of it coming undone was unnervingly loud in the quiet room, a sound of surrender. He peeled the fabric from her shoulders, and the cool air of the room on her heated skin made her gasp. The dress pooled around her waist, leaving her in nothing but a slip, and her black lace lingerie. His gaze was reverent as he looked at her, as if he were beholding a masterpiece. God, you're beautiful, he breathed, his artist's hands coming to rest on her bare shoulders, his touch both gentle and firm. He kissed the hollow of her throat, his lips trailing a path of fire down her collarbone. She arched her back, her head falling back in surrender, her protests now just breathless sounds, sighs of pleasure that were indistinguishable from pain. Leo, please, she gasped, but the meaning had changed. It was no longer a plea to stop, but a plea for more. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, carrying her the few feet to the sofa and laying her down on the soft velvet cushions. The storm raged outside, a wild, chaotic orchestra for the destruction of her world. And as he came down over her, his body covering hers, she finally let go, surrendering to the tempest within. The morning after the storm was unnervingly bright and still, the city washed clean. But for Alara, the storm had never ended. It had simply moved inside her. The guilt was a sharp, physical ache in her chest, but beneath it, a powerful, intoxicating current of adrenaline was flowing. She had broken the rules of her gilded cage. She had transgressed. And she had never felt more vividly, terrifyingly alive. That single night of surrender cracked open the carefully constructed dam of her life, and what followed was a flood. Her world, once a monochrome of silent, lonely days, exploded into secret, vibrant color. The art of their secret became the central focus of her existence, a dangerous and beautiful masterpiece they were creating together, moment by stolen moment. His studio became her sanctuary, their church. It was a large, chaotic loft in a gritty, anonymous part of the city, a place where no one would ever think to look for Mrs. Damien Blackwood. The journey there was a ritual of transformation. She would leave the penthouse in the guise of a trip to a gallery or a charity meeting, dressed in the elegant, severe armor Damien approved of. In the sterile anonymity of a department store dressing room, she would change into the woman who belonged to Leo. Soft jeans, a simple t-shirt, her hair pulled back under a silk scarf, hair face hidden behind dark sunglasses. Every step of the journey was fraught with a low hum of fear, the fear of a recognized face, of a stray camera flash, of a single, unlucky encounter that could bring their world crashing down. This constant thrumming danger was the fuel for their passion. The risk made the reward infinitely sweeter. The moment she would unlock the studio's heavy metal door and see him standing there, his face lighting up at the sight of her, the fear would melt away, replaced by a wave of relief and a desire so potent it left her breathless. The studio smelled of him, of them. It was the scent of linseed oil, coffee, and the unique warm fragrance of his skin. Here, surrounded by his half-finished canvases and splattered drop cloths, she shed the heavy mantle of her married name. She was not Mrs. Blackwood. She was Alara, and he worshipped her. Damien had never truly looked at her, but Leo saw every part of her with an artist's intense, appreciative eye. Some afternoons, he would simply have her lie on a worn velvet chaise lounge, and he would just watch her, his gaze tracing the lines of her body as if he were committing them to memory. "The curve of your hip right there," he'd murmur, his voice a low thrum. "The way it flows into your waist. It's the most perfect line I've ever seen." He would trace that line with his fingertips, his touch sending shivers across her skin, making her feel beautiful and seen in a way that had nothing to do with expensive gowns or diamonds. He made her body feel like a sacred text, and he was its most devoted scholar. Their lovemaking was a conversation, an exploration. For months, her body had been a dormant thing, an object she lived in but did not feel. With him, it awoke, demanding to be heard. He learned the language of her skin, the places that made her shudder, the way to draw a soft gasp from her lips. He would undress her slowly, reverently, his eyes never leaving hers. He admired the delicate lace of the new lingerie she bought, not for her husband, but for her lover, a secret she wore against her skin all day, a thrilling promise of what was to come. He'd kiss the hollow of her throat, the sensitive skin of her inner wrist, the arch of her foot. He made every inch of her feel cherished. Lying tangled in the sheets on his mattress on the floor, the afternoon light filtering through the grimy skylight, he would prop himself up on one elbow and look down at her. "Alara," he'd whisper, his voice thick with emotion. "Tell me you want this. Tell me you want me." And she, who had been silenced for so long, found her voice in the language of pure, unadulterated desire. "Leo." "Yes." She'd breathe, her hands pulling him down to her. "God, yes." The danger was never far away. Sometimes, her phone would buzz with a text from Damien's assistant, a reminder of some sterile social obligation, and the cold reality of her life would intrude upon their sanctuary. In those moments, their passion would take on a different edge, something more desperate, more urgent. It was a fight against time, a furious rebellion against the man who owned her life but could not touch her soul. One afternoon, after a particularly curt and demanding message from her husband, she turned to Leo with tears of rage and frustration in her eyes. He simply held her, letting her tremble, before his hands began to move over her with a fierce, possessive tenderness. He stripped her clothes away, not with reverence this time, but with a raw, hungry need that mirrored her own. Their lovemaking was frantic, almost violent, a desperate attempt to physically erase the world outside. He filled her senses until there was no room for anything but him, his scent, his taste, the feel of his body claiming hers. He held her face in his hands, his forehead pressed against hers, their ragged breaths mingling. "You're with me," he panted, his voice a command. "Here, now, you are mine." And in that moment, lost in the sweet, violent bliss of their secret world, she was. The intoxication was absolute, a powerful drug that made her forget the cage, the cold, and the inevitable price she would one day have to pay. The intoxicating high of a fever cannot last forever. Eventually, the delirium must break, leaving behind a chilling sweat and the stark, aching reality of the illness. For Alara, the fever of her affair with Leo began to break in small, insidious ways. The guilt, which she had successfully drowned in the intoxicating sea of passion, began to resurface, washing ashore in the quiet, lonely hours back in her cage. She would return from the raw, creative chaos of his studio to the sterile perfection of the penthouse, and the transition was a form of psychological whiplash. The scent of him, of oil paint and warm skin, would cling to her hair and her clothes, a ghostly presence in a home where he could never belong. She would strip off her secret anonymous clothes and stand under a scalding hot shower, trying to wash away the evidence of her betrayal, but she could never wash away the feeling. It had seeped beneath her skin, into her very soul. The cracks began to appear as hairline fractures in her composure. One evening, while waiting for a car to take her to a charity dinner Damien expected her to attend, she was straightening a stack of magazines on a glass coffee table. Her eyes fell upon the cover of Forbes. It was a picture of Damien, taken months ago. He was looking directly at the camera, his expression one of utter confidence and control, his cold slate eyes seeming to pierce right through the glossy paper and into her. A wave of nausea, swift and violent, washed over her. She flinched, physically recoiling from the image, her hand flying to her mouth. It was not a pang of love, or even loyalty. It was the ice-cold shock of reality. This was the man she was betraying. A man who did not tolerate failure, who did not forgive weakness, who crushed his enemies with the casual indifference of a god swatting a fly. Her secret life with Leo felt like a fragile, beautiful bubble, and the man in the photograph was holding a pin. The fear was no longer an abstract thrill, it was a cold, hard knot in the pit of her stomach. At the same time, the nature of her sanctuary began to change. Leo, who had once been her gentle, patient savior, was growing restless within the confines of their secret. The stolen hours were no longer enough for him. His love, once a quiet, warming fire, was becoming a more demanding flame. He began to resent the time she spent away from him, the life she had to return to. His texts became more frequent during the day, questions laced with a new possessiveness. "What are you doing? Who are you with? Are you thinking of me?" He would hold her tighter in the aftermath of their lovemaking, his embrace less of a comfort and more of a refusal to let go. The shift culminated one rainy afternoon in his studio. They were lying in his bed, the sound of the rain, a soft drumming on the roof. He was tracing patterns on her bare arm, his touch usually a soothing balm, but now it felt restless. "I hate this, Alara," he said quietly, his voice raw. "I hate sharing you with him. I hate the idea of you going back to that mausoleum, sitting across from him at that ridiculous table, wearing his diamonds." Alara's body tensed. "Leo, we knew what this was," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He turned to face her, his warm brown eyes filled with a fierce, desperate intensity she had never seen before. "I know what it was. But it's become something else, hasn't it? This isn't just an escape anymore." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "Leave him," he said, the two words dropping into the quiet room with the force of a bomb. "Leave him and be with me. We could go away. Italy like you talked about. We could have a real life, a life in the sun." The blood drained from Alara's face. His words, meant to be a beautiful promise, sounded like a death sentence. A real life? It was a fantasy. Damien would never allow it. He wouldn't just grant her a divorce. He would wage a war. He would destroy her, her father, and he would take a special, cruel pleasure in utterly annihilating the brother who had dared to take what belonged to him. The bubble hadn't just been threatened. Leo had tried to tear it open. A chasm opened up between them in that moment, right there in the intimacy of his bed. For him, the affair was a love story building towards its rightful conclusion. For her, it had been a desperate act of survival, and in her heart, the terrible, unanswerable question began to form. Was this love? Did she love Leo enough to risk absolute ruin for a life she couldn't even imagine? Or was he the beautiful, kind man who had appeared at the precise moment she was suffocating, the perfect key to unlock her cage for a few hours a week? Was their passion a product of true connection? Or was it simply a chemical reaction between her desperation and his desire? The uncertainty terrified her. She loved the way he made her feel alive, seen, desired. But the thought of blowing up her entire world for him sent a wave of pure panic through her. She pulled away from him, sitting up and wrapping a sheet around her body, a sudden, instinctive need for a barrier. "Leo, you don't understand," she said, her voice shaking. "It's not that simple. He would never just let me go." "Then we fight him," Leo insisted, his own frustration mounting. "I don't care about the money, the name. I only care about you." But she did care. She cared about her father, whom Damien could crush without a thought. And she cared about Leo, who had no idea of the true, boundless cruelty his brother was capable of. The argument, their first real one, ended in a tense, unhappy stalemate. The easy, breathable air of their sanctuary was suddenly thick with unspoken fears and mismatched expectations. The cracks were no longer invisible. They were beginning to spread, threatening to shatter their fragile, beautiful world. The fear that had taken root in Alara's heart was a cold and invasive species, choking out the fragile blossoms of hope that Leo had planted there. For a week, she wrestled with it. The image of Damien's face on that magazine cover burned into her mind. Every quiet moment was filled with the terrifying calculus of consequences. She saw her father's ruin, Leo's career and reputation turned to ash, her own life shrinking into an even smaller, colder corner of Damien's world. The conclusion was as unavoidable as it was agonizing. The only way to protect Leo was to cut him out of her life completely. The beautiful, secret thing they had built together had become too dangerous to sustain. It had to be dismantled, brick by painful brick. She went to his studio on a gray, overcast afternoon, the weather a perfect mirror of her soul. The journey felt like a walk to an execution. This time, there was no thrill, no delicious anticipation, only the heavy, leaden weight of what she had to do. He must have seen the decision on her face the moment she walked through the door, because the welcoming smile he always wore faltered, replaced by a look of wary concern. He came towards her, his arms open to embrace her, but she held up a hand, a small, involuntary gesture that stopped him in his tracks. The hurt that flashed in his eyes was like a physical blow, but she couldn't afford to be weak. Not now. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low and tight. She couldn't bring herself to look at him, focusing instead on a half-finished painting on an easel, a swirl of angry reds and deep blues. "Leo," she began, her own voice sounding thin and brittle. "We can't do this anymore. It has to stop." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant wail of a siren in the city below. "Stop?" He finally repeated, the word laced with disbelief. "What are you talking about?" "Alara, look at me." Reluctantly, she forced her gaze to meet his. "It's too dangerous," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "My husband, you don't know what he's capable of. I've been a fool, so reckless. He will destroy you, Leo, not just your career. He will ruin your life, and he will enjoy doing it. I can't. I won't be the reason that happens." He stared at her, his face hardening, the warmth in his eyes being extinguished, leaving behind a hurt that was quickly curdling into anger. "So that's it?" he said, his voice dangerously soft. "After everything, you're just gonna run back to your cage because you're scared? What about us? Was any of this real to you, or was I just a pleasant diversion until you got bored?" "That's not fair," she shot back, stung by the accusation. "This is not about being bored. This is about survival. This is me trying to save you from him." "I don't need you to save me," he said, his voice rising, stepping towards her until he was standing directly in front of her. "I need you to fight with me. I love you, Alara." The words, the ones she had secretly longed to hear, were now a torment. They were a brand, sealing her to a fate she was desperately trying to escape. "You can't," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Don't say that, please." She turned to leave, her hand on the cold metal of the doorknob. "You can't just walk away," he said, his hand closing around her arm, not roughly, but with a firmness that was absolute. She tried to pull away, but his grip was unyielding. The contact, born of conflict, sent a jolt of unwanted electricity through her. "Let me go, Leo," she pleaded. "No," he said, his voice ragged. He spun her around to face him, his other hand coming up to cup her jaw, forcing her to look at him. His face was a mask of anguish and raw desire, and then he kissed her. It was not like their first kiss, which had been a discovery. This was an act of desperation, a brutal, punishing kiss that was more about possession than affection. It was a statement. "You are not leaving me." Her mind screamed to resist. This was the exact weakness she had sworn to overcome. Her hands came up to push against his chest, her palms flat against the hard muscle. "Leo, stop," she cried out against his mouth, her voice muffled. "We have to stop this now." She shoved him, putting all her weight into it, and he stumbled back a step, breaking the kiss. They stood there, chests heaving, their ragged breaths filling the studio. His eyes were dark, almost black, with a wild, untamed emotion. For a moment, she thought she had broken through, but then he came for her again. This time, when his mouth found hers, her resistance was a lie her body refused to tell. As her lips said no, her body betrayed her, a shudder of pure, helpless desire running through her. Her push against his chest softened, her fingers uncurling and clutching at the fabric of his sweater. Her body, which had been so tense with fear and resolve, arched into his, seeking the very contact she was verbally rejecting. The sounds that escaped her throat were a fractured, desperate mix of protest and surrender, a soft, keening moan that was equal parts stop and don't ever stop. This was not the tender, worshipful passion they had shared before. This was something darker, more elemental. It was a frantic, almost violent collision of two people terrified of losing each other. His hands were tangled in her hair, his grip tight, while hers clawed at his back. Their clothes were torn away with a frantic, heedless urgency. Every touch was bruising, every kiss was a battle. It was a desperate, physical argument, a way of saying all the things they couldn't articulate. It was the passion of the doomed, clinging to each other on the edge of a precipice. He took her right there, against the rough brick wall of the studio, and the feeling of the cold, abrasive surface against her bare back was a grounding reality in the storm of sensation. There was no tenderness, only a raw, unvarnished need. It was a frantic attempt to reclaim a connection that was already broken, to physically brand themselves onto each other in a way that couldn't be undone. The climax, when it came, was not a gentle release, but a violent, shuddering crash, a wave of sensation so intense it felt like grief. In the echoing silence that followed, they slid down to the floor, their bodies slick with sweat, their breath still coming in ragged gasps. He didn't hold her. She didn't curl into him. They just sat there, inches apart in the ruins of their sanctuary, the chasm between them now terrifyingly clear. The desperate passion had solved nothing. It had only proven that she was more trapped than ever, a prisoner not just of Damien, but of a hopeless, destructive desire that she no longer had the strength to fight. The return to the penthouse, after that desperate, violent encounter in the studio, was a descent into a new kind of hell. Before, it had been a place of cold, sterile loneliness. Now it was a crime scene, and Alara was the sole, terrified perpetrator, constantly trying to scrub away evidence that was invisible to everyone but her. The passion had not fixed the cracks in their secret world. It had shattered it, leaving her exposed and trembling on the precipice of ruin. She moved through the silent, opulent rooms like a ghost haunted by her own recent past, the memory of his touch, his scent, the raw, angry desperation in his eyes, a constant, visceral presence. The affair was no longer a beautiful escape. It was a disease of the soul, and she felt its feverish, debilitating symptoms in every waking moment. Her resolve to end it was a fragile, brittle thing, and the silence from Leo in the days that followed was both a relief and a torment, leaving a void that was quickly filled by a rising tide of paranoia. Damien Blackwood was not a fool. It was the foundational truth upon which his empire was built. He was a man who noticed infinitesimal shifts in the market, a fractional change in a competitor's stock price, the slightest hesitation in a subordinate's voice. He had built his fortune by seeing the patterns others missed, and for the past several months, his wife had become a new and fascinating pattern to observe. He had noticed the change in her long before the desperate passion in the studio. It was a subtle shift in her energy. The listless, beautiful automaton he had married had been replaced by a woman with a strange, nervous light in her eyes. There was a tension in her shoulders, a new, almost defiant tilt to her chin. He had initially dismissed it as her finally settling into her role, but the change was too erratic. It was not the calm of acceptance, but the restless energy of a secret. And Damien Blackwood had an almost pathological intolerance for secrets he did not control. The first concrete clue was an olfactory one. He had returned from Shanghai a day early, a deliberate, unannounced move designed to keep his organization on its toes. That evening, at one of their silent, ritualistic dinners, he found himself watching her more closely than usual. She seemed distracted, jumpy, her fork trembling almost imperceptibly as she pushed a piece of sea bass around her plate. As the housekeeper cleared the main course, Damien rose from his chair, a gesture so unusual it made Alara look up, her eyes wide with alarm. He walked around the long table to her side, ostensibly to look out the window at the lights of the city. He paused behind her chair, placing a hand on its high back, leaning in slightly as if to point something out on the skyline. "The lights on the bridge are new," he commented, his voice a low, casual murmur. But he wasn't looking at the bridge. His senses, honed by years of predatory observation, were focused on her, and beneath the faint, clean scent of her expensive floral perfume, he detected something else. A foreign note, faint but distinct. It was sharp, chemical, and organic all at once. An artist's scent, turpentine and linseed oil. It was the smell of a world that had no place in his sterile, calculated existence, and no place in hers. He pulled back, returning to his seat without another word, but he filed the information away. An anomaly, an inconsistency in the data, and Damien always investigated anomalies. The second clue came 3 days later. Alara had grown careless, a common symptom of a mind consumed by anxiety. She had left her phone on a marble side table in the salon while she went to fetch a book from the library. Damien entered the room, and as he passed the table, the screen lit up. A single message on the locked screen, a name abbreviated to a single, damning initial, L. The message was simple, laced with an intimacy that was instantly incriminating. "We can't leave it like this. I need to see you." He didn't touch the phone. He didn't react. He simply observed the fact of it, the L connecting in his mind with the only logical person it could be, his foolish, sentimental, artist brother, Leo. The anomaly now had a name. The data points were connecting. A pattern was emerging. He felt no surge of hot, jealous rage. That was an emotion for lesser men. Instead, he felt a cold, thrilling curiosity, the intellectual excitement of a chess master who realizes his opponent has just made a fatal, predictable blunder. The game had just become infinitely more interesting. His tactics shifted. He no longer left her to her own devices. His surveillance, once passive, became active. He started coming home from the office earlier, surprising her in the late afternoon. He'd find her reading, or simply staring out the window, and she would jump at the sound of his arrival, a guilt so palpable on her face it was almost a written confession. He suggested they spend their evenings in the grand salon together. "We live in the same house, Alara," he said one night, his tone one of mock reasonableness. "We should at least pretend to enjoy each other's company." And so she was forced to sit in a chair opposite him, a book in her lap, the silence no longer empty, but charged with his watchful, unnerving presence. The suffocating atmosphere of the penthouse grew heavier, the air thick with unspoken things. His questions began, each one a subtle, exquisitely painful probe. He never accused. He simply inquired, his tone laced with a chilling, feigned innocence. "You seem distracted lately," he commented one evening, looking up from a financial report. "Is everything to your satisfaction?" The question was a trap, and they both knew it. If she said yes, she was lying. If she said no, she was inviting a deeper interrogation. "I'm just tired," she mumbled, her eyes fixed on the pages of her book. Another night, he brought up his brother. "I spoke to Leo today," he said, his voice casual. He sounded emotional. Always so driven by his passions, that one. It's his greatest weakness. He attaches himself to beautiful things he knows he cannot have. It's a shame. He's bound to get hurt. Every word was a poisoned dart aimed directly at her, a clear warning. He was telling her that he knew. He was showing her the board, explaining the rules of a game she had already lost. The gilded cage had become a torture chamber, and her husband, the silent, absent figure, had revealed himself to be her ever-present, all-knowing warden. The flicker of life he had noticed in her was the frantic, panicked flutter of a bird that has just realized the door to its cage is not only locked, but that the cat is now inside with it, watching and waiting. The message arrived late in the evening, a single, stark notification that lit up the darkness of Alara's bedroom. It was from Leo. After a week of agonizing silence that had stretched and frayed her nerves to the breaking point, his words on the screen were both a lifeline and a death sentence. "I can't live in this silence. I can't live without knowing. Meet me at the studio. One last time. We either make a plan to run, or we say goodbye for good." It was the ultimatum she had been dreading, the choice she was too cowardly to make, now laid bare before her. Her mind, conditioned by Damien's psychological warfare, screamed at her not to go. She could feel his watchful eyes on her even when he wasn't there. The penthouse had become a panopticon, and any deviation from her routine, any unscheduled trip, would be logged, analyzed, and used against her. To go to Leo now was not just reckless, it was suicidal. And yet, the thought of never seeing him again, of their passionate, desperate story ending on a note of angry silence and fear, was an agony too great to bear. To let the beautiful, terrible thing they had shared simply evaporate into nothing felt like a betrayal of the only real emotion she had felt in years. She needed to see his face one more time. She needed to feel his touch, to breathe in the scent of his studio, to say a proper, heartbreaking goodbye. The decision was an act of pure, self-destructive love. She waited until after midnight, when the building was deep in its slumber and the household staff had retired. She dressed in black, like a shadow, her movements furtive and silent. The journey across the sleeping city was a trip through a ghost world. Every headlight in her rearview mirror was a potential tale. Every solitary figure on a street corner was one of Damien's men. The fear was a living thing, a cold snake coiling in her gut, but she pushed it down. Tonight was not for fear. It was for Leo. The studio was dark when she arrived, lit only by the ambient, electric glow of the city filtering through the massive skylight. He was standing in the middle of the room, a silhouette against the distant lights, and she could feel the tension radiating from him. The air was thick with unspoken words, with sorrow and desperation. "You came," he breathed as she closed the door behind her, the sound of the deadbolt clicking into place feeling unnervingly final. "I had to," she whispered. They didn't rush into each other's arms. They stood apart, separated by a few feet of floorboards in a chasm of impossible choices. "Is there any hope, Alara?" he asked, his voice raw with a pain that mirrored her own. "Is there any version of this where we win?" She looked at his face, the face of the only man who had ever truly seen her, and the truth was a bitter acid on her tongue. "No," she said, a single tear tracing a cold path down her cheek. "He knows, Leo. I don't know how, but he knows. He's been watching me, playing with me, a cat with a mouse. Any move we make, he's 10 steps ahead. There is no running, there is no escape." The admission, the final, verbal surrender to their fate, did not lead to anger. It led to a profound, shared grief. He closed the distance between them, his movements slow, and gently wiped the tear from her cheek with his thumb. "Then this is it," he stated, not as a question, but as a fact. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "Then we make this last time mean something," he murmured, his forehead coming to rest against hers. "Let's say goodbye properly." This final encounter was unlike the others. It was not the hungry discovery of the first, nor the violent desperation of the second. This was a final, sacred rite. It was a conscious act of memorization, a slow, deliberate farewell to a love that was already dead. He undressed her with the tenderness of a historian, handling a priceless, fragile artifact. Every touch was a lament. His kiss was not demanding, but deep and sorrowful, tasting of salt and finality. This was not about a frantic physical release. It was about connection, a desperate attempt to absorb enough of each other to last a lifetime of loneliness. They made love with a quiet, painful slowness. His hands roamed her body not to incite passion, but as if to map every curve, every hollow, every scar, so that he might be able to draw her from memory in the dark days to come. She, in turn, clung to him, her fingers tracing the muscles of his back, her lips pressing silent, desperate promises against his skin. The sounds in the room were not the moans of raw pleasure, but the soft, broken whispers of two people saying goodbye. "I'll never forget the way you look in this light," he breathed into her hair. "Don't forget me, Alara," she pleaded, her voice thick with tears. It was the most intimate they had ever been, a fusion of bodies that was really a fusion of souls, both of them acknowledging the profound, tragic beauty of what they were about to lose. The climax was a quiet, shared wave of release and grief, a moment of perfect, painful clarity, where pleasure and sorrow were indistinguishable. They lay for a long time afterward, their limbs tangled, their hearts beating a slow, funereal rhythm. There was nothing left to say. They had said it all with their bodies. Finally, with a resolve that cost her everything, she untangled herself from him. Getting dressed was the hardest thing she had ever done. Each piece of clothing was a layer of armor, rebuilding the walls between them, returning her to the role of Mrs. Blackwood. He watched her from the bed, his face a mask of stoic heartbreak. She walked to the door and paused, her hand on the lock. She looked back at him one last time, trying to burn the image of him, of this room, of this moment, into her memory. "Goodbye, Leo," she whispered. He just nodded, his eyes glistening. He couldn't speak. She slipped out of the studio and into the cold, pre-dawn air of the city. For a moment, she felt a strange, hollow lightness. The secret was over. The decision had been made. There was nothing left to fear. She started walking down the deserted street, a solitary figure moving through the blue twilight. It was then that she saw it. Parked a half a block away, under the halo of a street lamp, was a familiar black sedan. The windows were tinted, but she didn't need to see inside. She knew who it belonged to. She could feel his presence, cold and patient, even from a distance. As she walked past, she heard the faint, almost imperceptible click of a camera's long-distance lens. The sound confirmed everything. He hadn't just been watching, he had been documenting. He had been collecting his evidence. A cold dread, far worse than any fear she had felt before, washed over her. This wasn't the end, it was just the end of their secret. Her true punishment was only just beginning. She kept walking, her pace steady, not towards freedom, but towards the man who was waiting to pass his sentence. The walk from the black sedan to the entrance of her building was the longest of Alara's life. Each step on the cold pavement was a footfall of doom, the sound echoing in the pre-dawn stillness. She did not run. She did not cry. A strange, terrifying calm had settled over her, the kind of calm that precedes an execution. She knew he was waiting. The private elevator ascended with a smooth, silent glide, a vertical coffin carrying her up to her judgment. When the doors opened directly into the penthouse's grand foyer, the scene was exactly as she had pictured it. The lights were low, casting long, menacing shadows, and he was there, standing by the vast window overlooking the awakening city, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He was still in the suit he had worn to his office the previous day, immaculate and uncreased, as if the passage of time did not apply to him. He turned his head slowly as she entered, his slate-gray eyes betraying nothing. There was no rage, no fire, no sign of a husband wounded by betrayal. There was only the cold, terrifying calm of a predator that has finally cornered its prey. "You're late," he said, his voice a low, even murmur that cut through the silence. He gestured with his glass toward a sleek, leather-bound portfolio on the mahogany table. "I was just reviewing the materials from my surveillance team. They do excellent work. Very thorough." Alara's legs felt weak, and she had to place a hand on the cool marble of a nearby pedestal to steady herself. She couldn't speak. Her throat was a knot of unshed tears and terror. He walked over to the table and opened the portfolio. He didn't throw the contents at her. He laid them out one by one with the detached precision of a curator arranging an exhibit. They were photographs, glossy and high resolution, capturing moments she had believed were theirs alone. There she was, laughing in the chaotic beauty of Leo's studio. There she was, her head thrown back in pleasure, her body tangled with his in his bed. There was the final, desperate kiss, the raw anguish on both their faces, perfectly, brutally preserved. He had taken their sanctuary and turned it into a sterile, damning file of evidence. "He is a sentimental fool," Damien said, swirling the whiskey in his glass as he looked down at the pictures of his brother. "To think he could take something that belongs to me and that I would not notice. To think that his passion," he said the word with a chilling distaste, "could ever be a match for my resources." He finally lifted his eyes to meet hers. "A public divorce would be unseemly. It suggests a lack of control, and I do not lack control. Over anything." He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. "So, we will not be divorcing. You will continue to be my wife. You will continue to smile at my side at galas. You will host my dinners, and you will perform your duties with the perfection I require." He took a slow sip of his drink. "But we need to address the issue of your hobby." He walked towards her then, stopping just a foot away, invading her space, his sheer physical presence an act of intimidation. "I could destroy you," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I could release these photos and you would be a social pariah. Your father's reputation would be incinerated along with his company, which I still own, by the way, but that seems unimaginative." A cruel, thin smile touched his lips. "Number, you I will keep, but him, Leo, I will erase. If you ever contact him again, if you so much as breathe his name to a friend, I will begin. I will start by ensuring his gallery drops him. Then I will use my influence on the boards of every museum in this country to have him blacklisted. I will buy the building his studio is in and have him evicted. I will discover any person he has ever cared for, any dream he has ever had, and I will systematically, patiently, and completely dismantle it all. I will leave him with nothing but his paintbrushes and a world that will not look at his work. I will not just ruin him, Alara. I will unmake him. To save him, all you have to do is cooperate." This was the true nature of his revenge. It was not a crime of passion, but a cold, calculated act of psychological torture. He had found the one thing she truly cared about, the one person she had rebelled for, and turned him into the very bars of her new, deeper cage. The choice was no choice at all. She would be the instrument of Leo's salvation and her own damnation. A single, choked sob escaped her. "I understand," she whispered. It was the only sound she made. "Good," he said, his voice devoid of any triumph. He had expected nothing less. He finished his whiskey and placed the glass down with a soft click. "Go and get some rest. We have the symphony tonight. You'll wear the diamonds, and you will smile." 6 months later, Alara Blackwood stood on the penthouse balcony, the cool night air a welcome relief against her skin. She was wearing a breathtaking gown of emerald green silk, and, as always, the diamonds. Below her, the city glittered, a beautiful, indifferent beast. A car horn blared, and she saw a young couple on the street corner below, laughing as they hailed a cab, their bodies close, their joy a brilliant, painful pinprick of light in the darkness. She watched them until they disappeared. Her face, reflected in the dark glass of the balcony door, was a perfect, serene mask. Her smile was beautiful, practiced, and utterly empty. She had done as she was told. Leo's number was blocked. His emails went unread. She had become the perfect wife, a stunning, silent automaton at Damien's side. She knew Leo was safe, and that knowledge was her daily poison and her only nourishment. Her rebellion had not won her freedom. It had cost her everything, tightening her chains in a way she could never have imagined. She was no longer just a bird in a gilded cage. She was now the warden of her own heart, diligently standing guard to ensure it never felt anything again. And as she turned from the balcony to go back inside to her husband, she knew her sentence was for life.